Tonight is one of my favorite nights of the year. Anybody with me? I love tonight. The reason it's one of my favorite nights of the year is that I'm guaranteed to get pigs in a blanket tonight. Yeah, that's what I'm talking about. There's also a game on TV. You'll see a guy, he's pretty special. He'll be running around, handling the ball a lot. Maybe he'll do a few no-look passes. Who knows, with this guy, he might even pass the ball behind his back. I have no idea. Every time there's this big audience, this kid who's growing into a man just surprises the football world. His name's Patrick Mahomes. And tonight, he plays for a Super Bowl. He's young. One of the youngest quarterbacks to ever play in the Super Bowl. Last year, he became the youngest MVP in NFL history and held that title until last night when Lamar Jackson took it from him, being about 90 days or so a little younger. Patrick Mahomes is pretty special. People continue to marvel at what he accomplishes on the football field. If you watch the game tonight, you could probably tune in about an hour or so ahead of time, and a lot of the content is going to be this guy. They're going to go into in-depth. They'll probably show highlights from college and highlights from high school and highlights from Pop Warner and all those things. They'll just be talking about him over and over and over again, right? And he didn't go to the greatest football school in college, you know? It wasn't one of the top tiers that you see that are in the college football playoff rankings every single year. It wasn't one of those kind of colleges. It was a decent college. But it wasn't one of those top, huge, massive colleges you see year in and year out. He was overlooked. He was overlooked for quite a while. Made a name for himself. And most folks will take a look at whatever he does tonight, and they'll think, man, look at those gifts. Look at those talents. It was interesting. I was reading an article just this past week about Patrick Mahomes, and something stood out to me that I'd never seen before. And I'm not his biggest fan. I've just been following him lately as he's been just wreaking havoc on the teams he's been playing. Something that stood out to me was he's had the same trainer since he was in 4th grade. The same trainer. The same guy that he's working out with. Getting one more workout in right now probably before he goes on the field this evening. Getting warmed up. The very same guy he started working with in 4th grade. That trainer knows so much about him. In fact, the reason he met this trainer was because this trainer actually trained his father. And that's where they met for the first time. He saw something in Patrick that said, yeah, I'll continue to work with you. Boy, did that pay off. Patrick is much more famous than his father right now. That's a lot of work. 4th grade to now. That's a lot of work for one night. That's a lot of determination for one night. And who knows, maybe Patrick Mahomes is going to be the next Brady, and it won't be just for one night, but for 5 or 6. But ultimately, every single person that puts on a uniform, everyone wants to win the Super Bowl. The question becomes, who will work the hardest for it? Who has the most grit? We're going to spend a little bit of time looking at someone who I think exemplifies this idea of grit. We find his book and his story in the Old Testament. The Bible's kind of broken up into 2 parts, the Old Testament and the New Testament. And so the Old Testament chronicles this story of God bringing the world to a place where it could receive Jesus. And then the New Testament takes us forward from the birth of Jesus into the birth of the church, which is where we are now. And so this particular story that we're going to follow for the next 4 weeks is found in the Old Testament. If you are following along, you can open your Bibles to Daniel chapter 1. And you can just hang out there. We'll put most of this on the screen as we kind of walk through it. But to give you a little bit of background, the Old Testament was all about God creating a nation. He had to get the world to where it could receive Jesus, and to do that, he wanted to make sure that lineage was kind of on point and in its correct and proper order. He wanted to make sure there was a nation there that he would instill values into, and so that's what this Old Testament really chronicles. God interacts with us today in a very different way than he did in the Old Testament. There were different purposes for why God would interact with humanity. In the Old Testament, God would interact in a very audible way oftentimes, or he would interact through very specific people called prophets, where he would have a conversation with them or a dream with them, and he would move them in a particular way, and they would then go and tell the people of God. In the Old Testament, there was a particular nation that God was attached to. He said, these are my people, this is my nation. That nation doesn't exist anymore. I mean, yes, the Jewish people exist, right? The nation of Israel, that whole idea, they exist. But God's people are not the Jewish people anymore. God's people are the church, the bride of Christ. Those are God's people. And so we have to be really careful as we're reading through the Old Testament. There's a lot for us to gain and learn and wisdom to pull from it. However, we got to make sure we recognize that God is not going to interact with us in a very similar way that he interacted with the people as he's creating a nation of God followers and God fearers, so that ultimately he can turn those people over to Jesus, which then gives birth to the church. And so what I don't want to do is ascribe some of these things we're going to kind of read and say, you know what, that reminds me a lot about America, right? And I just don't think it works that way. God is going to punish here in this, as we're about to look into, God is going to punish the nation of Israel for being disobedient. And so sometimes I've seen on the Facebooks, we just came out of a series talking about Facebook, where people will talk about maybe God will punish America for its deviance and all those kind of things. God's not really worried about America right now. I know in God we trust, but God's like looking at his church. That's his primary concern, is the church. And specifically for the church, his primary concern for them is, are you reaching out to lost people? Not are you creating great governments? Not are you managing Congress and Senate and all those kind of things. And so I just don't want you to lose that. As we read this, you're like, you know what? That reminds me of America. And I'm going to post today, watch out, or Daniel 1's going to happen. That's just not going to happen, It's not going to happen. I just wanted to set that straight. Timeline. We're about 600 BC, so about 600 years before Jesus appears. We're 600 years prior to the world being ready to receive the Messiah, Jesus Christ. That's where we're at. Daniel has some friends, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And those four, they're pretty fancy guys, highly educated. They're a part of a group that really stands out in the Jewish people. And they're kind of, minding their own business. Growing up, they're probably around late teenage years or so, but they're thriving. And then all of a sudden, they're thrown into some turmoil, these four guys, because of a king that's really having some difficulty following God. And so we're gonna break it down from the beginning. This nation of Israel was struggling to obey God. And so God finally said, hey, if you don't get things right, I'm going to give you over to another nation. And so you've been my people, and I've been leading you, but if you don't correct these things, I'm going to let someone else come in, and they're going to take over you as a nation. And of course, the nation of Israel didn't listen, right? So those four guys, they're still following God. It's not holistically 100% of the people, but a large majority, specifically the leadership, has made a decision, I'm not following the directives of God. And so God says, you know what? Well, I'm going to let someone else come in and take you over, right? And so that's what happens. Just so happens there's a king named Nebuchadnezzar from Babylon. Babylon came in, took over Israel, and then he decided, you know what? I want to take the best and brightest, the best looking, the smartest, all those things, all those royal people that have been educated, I want to bring them to Babylon from Israel, and I want to assimilate them into our culture so that we can use the best and brightest for our advantage. Those four guys were in that. So God says, hey, I've had enough. The leadership doesn't listen. Here comes Babylon. They take over Israel. They take the best and brightest. They move them from Israel all the way over into Babylon. So it's what we now call as the Babylonian exile. They've been exiled over here. And while they're there, they're starting to get educated. They learn the language. They learn how to read. They learn the culture. All these guys that were brought in, the best and brightest, they learn the culture of the Babylonians, all those things. For 3 years, they undergo this training. And after 3 years, they're supposed to serve on the court of the king. Well, in this particular instance, right at the beginning, these 4 guys are introduced to not only learning the language and dressing like a Babylonian and learning all the Babylonian culture, all those things, they're also expected to eat what the Babylonian king is eating. And so it's the responsibility of the king to provide for the people that are going to serve on his court. And so he decides these guys that he's brought over from Israel, these best and brightest, he brings them over and says, hey, I'm going to give to you from my table. So the best food that we have in all of Babylon, I'm going to give to you during your 3 years so that you'll be strong and healthy, so that you realize that, hey, I want good for you and we expect good from you in return. And so there's a really good relationship. Well, Daniel has an issue with this. He has an issue because God specifically has given the Jewish people some rules about what they can and can't eat. And it's not going to fall in line with what the king is offering to them. And so he decides, I'm going to go and ask for an exception. And so he goes to the guy who's in charge of him and says, hey, here's the deal. I don't want to eat this food. I know that sounds weird because it looks scrumdiddlyumptious and all those things. Like, it looks great. However, it would be bad for me as a Jewish guy to eat this. So can I just eat some vegetables, right? Can I eat some vegetables and some water and then some fruit? That's what I'm going to eat. Is that cool? And of course the guy responds, he's like, look, I understand. This is new to you. This is different. However, no, you can't do that because I'm responsible. And when the king sees that you're puny and wimpy because you're not eating your meat, and that you're eating potatoes, when he sees that you're all scrawny, he's going to come after me. He's not going to come after you. He's going to come after me, replace me, and then they're going to force feed you, and then you're going to look like you're supposed to, but I've lost my life, so it's not going to happen, right? So Daniel's like, okay, cool. So then he goes to the guy that's just underneath him, and he goes to him and says, hey, kind of whispering, the Bible doesn't say he was whispering. I'm imagining he was whispering. He said, hey, can I get some different food? And the guy tells him the same thing. He's like, no, we can't do this. He says, how about this? How about for 10 days, you feed me what I'm asking? And at the end of 10 days, if we look scrawny and puny and all those things, then we'll eat whatever you ask. But if at the end of 10 days, if we're like saucy strong, then you let me keep eating my vegetables, And so the guy's like, all right, deal, 10 days. Sets his watch. He's like, 10 days. At the end of 10 days, he's looking back and forth. He said, man, this is incredible. Like, vegetables do a body good, I guess. And they're looking at these 4 guys and like, man, y'all look incredible. Like, you're just sculpted. You're just fantastic, Reminds them a lot of me. And okay. It's awkward. So he's having this conversation, right? He's having this conversation. Like, man, this is great. You can continue to do this. And then, on top of that, the king starts interacting with him and realizes that not only king doesn't know anything about this food stuff, but he just recognizes these 4. He's like, man, these 4 are better and brighter than anybody else I got. Anybody else I got. And so he begins to give them better assignments, bigger assignments, and trust them with more things. Daniel goes on to serve the entire time that the Babylonians are in power. Daniel serves the whole time. He gives and gives and gives to a foreign king in a foreign land and serves them incredibly well. We've got to pull a few things from it. I guess the first thing we've got to ask is, why was there an exile from a promised land? If you're someone who is big on biblical history, that term promised land is something that's just thrown around constantly because at one point as he's building this nation, he says, hey, God's telling his people, I have a place for you, and if you'll trust me and follow me, then I'm going to give you this land that's just gorgeous and it's perfect and it's everything you need, and you'll be able to build a nation and grow a nation and become a nation and all those things, and I have this land that I've prepared in advance for you. So they're in this promised land and they're taken from it. One must begin to ask the question, is God breaking promises? Aren't we talking about the people of God in the promised land given by God? being taken out of the promised land by God, sent to a foreign land by God. Here's some background in 2 Chronicles, also in the Old Testament, a completely different book than Daniel, but gives us a little insight. It says this: Jehoiakim was 25 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem for 11 years. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord his God. Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, attacked him and bound him with bronze shackles to take him to Babylon. So that gives you a little bit of context, right? So someone else is looking at the people of Israel and the leadership of Israel not following God's commands, and here he is. He's now in a different country. God continued to tell his people, I need you to listen. I need you to follow me. And they just wouldn't. In fact, hundreds of years ahead of this time, Moses, not only was God saying this, Moses was telling his people, hey, here's the deal. If we do not do what God has asked us to do as a nation, God is not going to continue to protect us as a nation, right? That's what he's trying to tell them. And so we pick up with the story in Daniel 1, verse 2. It says, and the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, talking about Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia and put in the treasure house of his God. In other words, hey, God did two things. God delivered, that's what the verse says, God delivered into his hand the king, these exiles, these people, and some of the things from the temple of God. So God delivered. Literally in Hebrew, the word means he gave, right? He gave. He said, hey, this is not going to be my possession anymore. It's going to be your possession. I'm giving to you these people who are disobedient, along with the people who are obedient are going to suffer along with it because the leadership wasn't on board with it. And so they lumped them together, and they're exiled, and God gave them. And not only did God give them people, God also gave them some of the things that were inside of God's temple where people came to worship him. God's things, God's people, he gave for disobedience. God gave his people from the promised land to a foreign land. Babylon is in modern day, what we know today as modern day Iraq. He gave articles from his temple where he is the supreme God, and he put them in other temples of gods that aren't even real. And the question is why? Why? Why did all these things have to happen? Why? Simply put, when we're talking about the people of Israel, the people of God, they didn't want to be God's people. They just wanted God's benefits. They didn't want to be God's people. They just wanted God's benefits. I think that's something we could learn a little bit from. How often do we find ourselves in a very similar situation? You know, I'm not really sure I want to give my entire life to God and submit it to his leadership and authority. But I do want the benefits that comes with being a child of God. I do want those things. God had had enough. What's interesting here is that the author of the book gives us a hint into the way that God gives or God delivers into the hands of this foreign land. In verse 2, where it says, and the Lord gave, or the Lord delivered, that's not the traditional word that we would see for Lord. Usually we would have Yahweh there, which is the way that the Jewish people would come to or announce the name of God. We have a different name for Lord there. It's Adonai. The difference between Yahweh and Adonai is its core meaning or the core truth behind the name. Adonai means owner or ruler or sovereign. In other words, he's saying, hey, when God decided to give his people and give his things, he was demonstrating that these people belong to me. They are mine. And I'm going to give them to you. Now, here's the interesting thing. Though God gave them away, God did not abandon them. He went with them. And so though the people and the things no longer belonged to him, they were under someone else's authority. They were in someone else's house. They were in someone else's country, in someone else's land. God still went with them. Daniel and his friends are submitted to learning a new language. Now they know Hebrew and Aramaic, and they've added to it Persian. They have a new culture. They read new literature. All of those things are fine. They're even given new names. Daniel, Belshazzar, Hananiah, Shadrach, Mishael, Meshach, Azariah, Abednego. New names, new language, new culture, new clothes, new land, new responsibilities. But when it came to food, they said enough's enough. I said, I'm not going to do it. Food laws for Jewish people, two that are really fairly significant for them, is that nothing could be sacrificed to idols before they ate it. And so if someone went into a foreign temple of a god and made an animal sacrifice, oftentimes the royalty or the priests would then be able to eat that food that was offered in sacrifice. A lot of times that food would be then put on the king's table, and from the king's table is where they were being fed. So he said, hey, we can't do that. God specifically said, hey, this is not what I want you to do. And then the other big food law for Jewish folks was that the blood had to be completely drained out of the animal if you were going to eat it. And that wasn't the case with the way the Babylonians cooked their food, prepared it. I think it's interesting that the reason that they're exiled, the reason this is happening is because of lack of obedience. And all of a sudden, the story that leads here in Daniel chapter 1 is, let me get back to the heart of the simplest things that God has asked us to do, which is what we decide to eat and not eat. You see, God didn't say, hey, you couldn't learn another language. God didn't say you couldn't read other literature books. God didn't say that you couldn't be a part of a foreign culture. God didn't say that you couldn't not work for someone who didn't believe in God. God didn't say any of those things. All God said was, hey, here's the deal. And these new things that you are doing, what I don't want you to do is eat from this food. And so they begin to write this narrative of obedience in the middle of their persecution, in the middle of their exile, in the middle of their punishment, because they recognize that though God had given them away to the authority of someone else, they still counted themselves as sons of God, as part of the family of God. It's like they understood that the first step when in the middle of disobedience is to begin to obey. The very first step when they caught themselves in this long generational disobedience was just to simply begin to obey. How much sense does that make for us? That in the middle of the mess that we create for ourselves, sometimes what we do is we convince ourselves that, man, I've already messed this week up, and so I'll start again on Monday. It's Friday night or it's Saturday night, and Friday night just wasn't my night, and I made some mistakes Friday night, so I got one more night to get this out of my system, and maybe Sunday night, I got to be working on morning, and then on Sunday and Monday morning, I'm going to start fresh. I'm going to get this right, you know? New week, new me, you know? New year, new me, whatever it is. Daniel's like, I don't really know if I can wait until this noticeable new start. Maybe the best opportunity to begin again is just the very next opportunity you have to obey. I don't know what it must be like to live in a land that's not what was promised to you. I don't know what it's like to grow up in one place and be forcibly removed to go to another. I don't know what it's like to suffer with my living circumstances because of someone else that was in charge of me, made some really poor decisions, and it trickled down for decades, and then ultimately I received punishment for it. I don't know what that's like. I don't want to know what it's like to be forced to learn a new language when I didn't ask to learn a new language. I don't know what it's like to be forced to leave my culture behind, to create new norms. I don't know what that's like. And I can't imagine what it must be like as a teenager to be forced to do that. I've interacted with students for a long time, and one of the most difficult things to watch a student go through is to move from one place to another in the middle of middle school or in the middle of high school. It's like their world is just like, I don't know how to rebuild the world that I've been trying to build for myself this whole time. And oftentimes they don't have a choice in it. Now, a lot of the times when they get plugged into great friends, they recognize that, hey, I can build my life over again. But man, for those students who don't, and that's what we're talking about here, these four guys are late teens at best. They're having to rebuild everything. I don't know what that's like. I can't imagine waking up being punished for someone else's decisions to that extreme. And yet Daniel and his friends, his very first thought is, how do I get out of this? I'll just be obedient to God. How do I set myself into a new path? I'll just be obedient to God. We pick it up there in 1 verse 8. It says, but Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine. Resolved is such an incredible word. Daniel made a decision in the midst of all of that trouble, in the midst of all of that change, in the midst of all of those things he didn't deserve and didn't earn, in the midst of all of that suffering and all of these things that are introduced to his life. Who knows how much family he's left behind back in his homeland? Who has any idea about those things? In the middle of all those things, it says Daniel resolved himself. I guess maybe the thing we can pick up this morning is resolve to do what is right even when everything around you is wrong. Resolve to do what is right even when everything around you is wrong. In other words, I think this is a better way to say it. Convenient Jesus is not real. There's no such thing as convenient Jesus. Following Jesus requires resolve. If you want to follow Jesus, the chances are, maybe not to this extreme where you're completely taken from your home for someone else's decision and forced into a new culture and a new language and a new way of life, and you leave everybody you care about. Maybe that's not going to happen to you. However, following Jesus is never always convenient. If it is always convenient, you should probably tap the guy on the shoulder you think is Jesus and get him to turn around. And you'll probably find it's not Jesus. It's just some guy who had really long brown hair that you're following. Convenient Jesus is not real. And so you have to ask, what is this thing that exists inside of Daniel that we wished existed inside of us? We call it grit. Grit is courage and resolve. It's strength of character. Where are you at on your grit scale? Scale of 1 to 10. Where are you at? 1 being, I've got no resolve, no strength of character. I've got no grit. The only thing I've got is convenient Jesus. Like, I am so happy with Jesus when I come in and Lindsay or Jess or Aaron or Kevin or Chloe, they sing the song I've been waiting for. Like, man, when they sing that song, this is good Jesus right here. You know what I'm saying? Like, that's the Jesus you like. Or when you come to church, you're like, you know what? They sang my song and they got the ice cream. I want out an ice cream truck. I love this kind of Jesus, you know? Fill in the blank with the kind of convenient Jesus you want to follow. But on a scale of 1 to 10, where are you at? So that's 1. What's 10? 10, I think, you got to be really close, is you can lose your family and lose your language and lose your culture, lose your customs, lose your home, and your first decision is to be faithful to God. I think that's probably fairly close to a 10, right? Maybe that's 9.5. Maybe it's 9.125. Let's just go with 9. That's 9. 10's got to be Jesus on the cross, right? I don't want to undo that much grit the garden, having to go through the anguish of, hey, are we really going to get there or not? Am I really going to give my entire life for Jesus and the entire sin of the entire world? Like that kind of thing. So I mean, that's 10. Daniel's at 9.125. Where are you on that scale? At what point is your first thought no longer, the first thing I should do is be faithful? In fact, maybe the better question is, at what point in the scale do you go from my first thought is faithfulness to my first thought is how do I fix this? Because if you recognize at some point, faithfulness will lead to fixing. But if you try to fix it before you're faithful, sometimes you end up breaking more things. Can we get our grit scale to increase? Maybe that's a better question. If you're sitting at a 3, what do you have to do to get your grit to increase to say 6 or 7? Think about it. I hope everyone has a number in their head right now between 1 and 10. It can't be 10, by the way. Like, it can't be. So those of you who are like, I'm a grown man and I got so much grit, you don't even know what. You can't be Jesus. So let at least come down to Daniel's 9.125, okay? So what's your number? And how do you get it to increase? How do you increase your courage and resolve? How do you increase your strength of character? Daniel wanted to prove his grit. He said, hey, let's try this for 10 days. His result was he won. We pick up in 120, it says, in every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom. In other words, at the end of their 10 days, as they continued in this program of, hey, we just want to be obedient to God, and in the continuation of their obedience, the people that were around them that now had authority over them, that they technically belonged to, recognized that, man, whatever you are doing is creating something so significantly special in you that's 10 times more than anybody else. So whatever you're doing, just keep doing it, is what he's saying. The good that we are receiving from our interaction with you is just, it's so valuable to our kingdom. Have you ever thought about that? A follower of Jesus being beneficial to someone who does not believe in God. Does that resonate with you? You see, Daniel and his friends, they became useful as a servant in a godless land. But that's not how the story ends. I told you at the beginning, 121, it says, and Daniel remained there until the first year of King Cyrus. Cyrus was king of Persia, and eventually, decades and decades later, Cyrus comes in and they defeat the Babylonians. In other words, Daniel outlived his captors. He never escaped from them. He never fixed them. He didn't win the entire country to being God followers and God fearers. They didn't build a temple in Babylon and begin to worship Yahweh. But he outlived them. He outlived them. In other words, circumstances must not dictate our faithfulness. I guess the question for us is, what are examples of circumstances that oftentimes do dictate our faithfulness? Think about them. Like I said, most of us are probably not getting shipped off to another country, another language, another culture, all of those things. That's probably not going to happen to you. So what are the things that sometimes dictate our faithfulness? Divorce? In the midst of that, when one person is so angry and full of malice, and you've resolved there's nothing else you can do, and then you have to decide, as you are now in this foreign land that you maybe did not ask to be in. How do you ask the question, what's the first faithful thing I can do to God? In large family disagreements, typically the other party is going to be super wrong. They've done all the wrong things, said all the wrong things, treated you all the wrong ways. That they're not operating in the way that God would if God got to put together the way your family was put together. What's the first faithful thing that you can do? What's the first act of obedience that you can do on God's behalf? Maybe it's abuse. Maybe it's for you seeing abuse. That you're witness to it or aware of it. And you're wondering, what is the very first thing I should do? And I would ask, what's the first faithful act you can do? This just isn't for negative circumstances, though. It's for the positive as well. When everything is going right in our life and everything is going correct and just the way we had planned it, in those moments, are we still able to say, and now what is the first faithful act of obedience that I can do in my life? Obviously, you win the lottery, people are, for some reason, are just like they made a TV show about stupid decisions that people do with the lottery when you win it, you know? So obviously it's difficult when something goes the way you always dreamed. For some reason, the very first thing we're thinking about is, and how could I be possibly obedient to God? When you get into your dream school that you've been working so hard to get in, when you finally get that promotion that you worked your tail off for, whatever it is, grit is required in those moments too. That the grind is up against the positive things as well as the negative things. I guess the biggest question for us to ask this morning, if we go back to Patrick, and you talk about the grit that it's required for him to grow into one of the youngest MVPs in NFL history, to be playing in the game of all games tonight at such a young age, we find a clue that it's hidden in his grit. That since fourth grade, he's been training for this evening. This evening didn't just occur. His MVP award last year did not just happen. It just didn't appear out of thin air. That it's been countless hours, time after time after time, that he's gone through the motions, it would seem, and come into a place where he's ready to perform at an incredibly high level. I guess the question that's most important is, what are we doing ahead of time to prepare ourselves to have that kind of grit that it takes to be obedient as our first response? What are the things that we're doing in advance? You see, Jesus' decisions must be your norm prior to being pressed. Pressing is coming for everyone. That pressing or that squishing, that collapsing that feels like it's happening on your life, that will happen for all of us. But our Jesus decisions, that has to be the norm for us before the pressing begins. Pressing is coming, grit will be required. I think here's our biggest takeaway. You aren't born with spiritual grit. You make it with spiritual discipline. You aren't born with spiritual grit. You make it with spiritual discipline. I think it's probably time that we take an honest inventory of our grit score and we ask, where should we really be? In our spiritual grit inventory, what number should we be at? And then the question that must follow that is, what do you need to do to get there? Because it won't just happen. You have to make it. You make spiritual grit. It comes out of your spiritual discipline. I think as we go into a time of communion, that should be part of your reflection. What's your number? And what's one thing you need to do to increase it. I think for all of us, it will be different. Some of us will have to rearrange some of our morning time. And maybe you're thinking, I don't have a lot of time in the morning. You have plenty of time. Just open your eyes a little earlier. Some of us will have to reorganize how we close out our evenings. Spiritual discipline happens outside of the lights. It happens outside of the public eye. It happens in the quiet moments. It happens when no one is watching. It happens when you have a myriad of other options to entertain yourself or to relax and just unwind. That are your moments to create your spiritual grit. It's the work you put in those moments that you will then see the result in your very public moments. When the pressing happens and everyone is on the outside looking at you in the middle of your pressing, it's then they will see the result of those quiet moments. They will see the work that you put in, or they will see the lack of it. Pressing is coming for all of us. Grit will be required. What's your number? What's your number? And what do you need to do to increase it?